The ad was 22 words long. I counted them the first time I read it, and counted them again the next morning with my coffee going cold beside me, because I could not quite believe that a man's entire need could be reduced to so few. Widower, 6 daughters, ages 2 to 17. 40 acres, Nebraska, seeks a woman who can cook and manage a house. Steady character preferred. That was it. No poetry. No mention of companionship or the particular loneliness that grows inside a house full of people who have all lost the same person. Just cook, manage the house. Steady character. I was 38 years old. My husband Robert had been gone 2 years and 4 months, and the boarding house we had run together in Cincinnati had followed him 6 months later, absorbed by debts I had not known about until the lawyers began arriving. I had a trunk of clothes, my mother's cast-iron skillet, and $311 folded inside a handkerchief in my coat pocket. I had run a house for 8 years and fed people well for longer than that, which is not nothing, but it is not the kind credential that opens many doors. I answered the ad on a Tuesday. The man's name was Thomas Aldridge. He wrote back in 11 days, his handwriting tight and slanted, the script of a man who had learned to write efficiently and had never thought much about it since. He confirmed what the ad had said and added only that the youngest girl was 22 months and still nursing from a bottle because there had been no one to wean her properly. He did not mention his wife. He did not say how she had died. He asked 3 questions. Could I bake bread? Did I know anything about chickens? Was I willing to arrive before October, before the cold came and the farm work pressed hardest? I wrote back that I could bake any bread he named, that I had kept a flock of 12 chickens in the back garden of our boarding house until the neighbor's fence blew down and the dog got into them, that I would arrive in September. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The train let me out at Platte Falls on a Thursday afternoon, 2 days and 1 night from Cincinnati, with trunk heavier than I had remembered it being, and a sky so open it made me catch my breath. Ohio had sky too, but Nebraska had a different kind, wider and more indifferent about it. The kind of sky that does not care whether you find it beautiful or overwhelming or simply enormous, and that makes you feel in a way that is not entirely unpleasant, like a very small thing standing on a very large piece of ground. Thomas Aldridge was waiting at the platform with a farm wagon and a face that matched his handwriting. Tight, efficient, whatever warmth had been in him once. He was keeping it somewhere private now, somewhere he had put it and closed the door. He was 46, taller than I had imagined from the letters, with a particular leanness of a man who works hard and forgets to eat. His hands, when he lifted my trunk, were the color of old leather, and the backs of them were mapped with old cuts healed into white lines. The hands of someone who had been working land for 20 years and expected to work it 20 more. He said, "Mrs. Ware." Not a question. I said, "Mr. Aldridge." He put the trunk in the wagon and walked around offering me a hand up, which he did without ceremony and without comment. The way you help someone onto a wagon you have offered to give them a ride in. He did not say he was glad I had come. He did not tell me anything about the drive ahead. He climbed up beside me and spoke to horses. The Aldridge farm was 6 miles from Platte Falls, west along a road that was half dried mud and half wagon rut, through country that looked like it had never quite decided whether it wanted to be grassland or crop field. We passed 3 other farms before his. Each of them was running, clotheslines full, smoke rising from chimneys, the sound of cattle somewhere beyond the ridgeline, a dog barking at our wagon as we passed. There was life in those farms, not abundance. Nobody in that county was abundant, but maintenance. The particular daily effort of keeping things going. When the Aldridge farm came into view at the crest of a low hill, I saw immediately that it was not quite keeping pace with its neighbors. The house was wood frame, 2 stories, with a porch that leaned slightly to the left and a kitchen garden that had been picked over but not put to bed for autumn, the dead plants still standing in their rows like something nobody had gotten around to. A basket of mending sat on the porch step. The yard was clean enough but had the particular look of a place managed by someone doing more than they could manage, where the keeping up had become the whole life, and there was nothing left over for anything that was not strictly necessary. The barn behind the house was solid and well maintained, the roof in good repair, the doors hung true. That told me what Thomas thought about first when he woke in the morning and what he left for last at night. 6 girls were waiting in the yard and on the porch. The 2 youngest were in the dirt near the fence, playing at something with sticks and a tin cup, indifferent to the wagon's arrival the way small children are indifferent to anything that is not immediately interesting to them. The middle one stood together at the top of the porch steps, watching us come in with the careful attention of children who have watched strangers arrive before and have learned not to assume that arrival means staying. The eldest stood apart from all of them, one shoulder against the porch post, her arms folded across her chest. She had her father's posture and her father's stillness, and the look of someone who has already made up her mind about the outcome. Thomas stopped the wagon in the yard. "That's Ruth," he said, gesturing once without pointing, as if I should be able to identify her by the description alone, which I could. 17. She runs things. He said this the way you say a fact about the weather, neither a compliment nor a complaint. Clara is the tall one, 15. Addie is 11. Lily is 9. Bess is 6. A pause, shorter than it seemed. The baby is Pearl. I looked for Pearl. She was in Ruth's arms, I realized, pressed against the older girl's shoulder with her face turned in toward the collar. Dark hair. A small fist curled against Ruth's neck. Ruth was holding her the way a person holds something they have decided is their responsibility. Not loosely, not absently, but with a specific grip of someone who has made a decision and keeps making it every day. Thomas climbed down from the wagon. He did not say anything more about Pearl. He carried my trunk to the house and left me to follow. The next hour taught me more than 3 months of letters had managed. Clara, 13 and taller than her age, helped me carry my smaller bag inside without being asked and then disappeared before I could thank her. The particular vanishing act of a girl who wants to be useful but does not want to be seen wanting it, who has learned that wanting things is how you end up disappointed. Addie, 11, watched me from doorways away. A naturalist watches a new specimen, interested and cautious, and not yet committed to a verdict. She had a stillness about her that was different from Thomas's, less guarded, more observational. She was cataloging me. I let her. Lily, 9 years old, had eyes that held the specific grief of a child who has not yet found a way to stop expecting her mother to come through a door that is not going to open. She was the prettiest of the girls, which had nothing to do with anything, except that it made the sadness on her face more visible, more difficult to look at without wanting to say something that would not help. She did not speak to me the first day. She watched my hands when I moved around the kitchen. Bess was 6 and adapted to new things with the completeness of small children who have not yet learned to be guarded about it. Within 20 minutes of my arrival, she had found me in the kitchen and was telling me the names of every chicken individually, which she had given them herself. I learned that the large red hen was named Josephine, that Josephine had a difficult personality but was a reliable layer, and that the brown hen near the fence was called Mrs. Hartley and was, according to Bess, very sensible. I received this information with the gravity it deserved. Then Ruth said, "Mrs. Ware, there are some things to know about how this house runs." She was 17 years old, and she had been holding this household and 5 younger sisters and a father who had gone hollow inside for 22 months. She had done it without being asked, because someone had to and she was the oldest one there, and she had done it so completely and so thoroughly that the household ran. It fed everyone. It kept everyone clothed and sleeping and present, and yet there was not a warm thing in it. There was management. There was maintenance. There was a particular effort of someone doing their absolute best under conditions that were 2 sizes too large for them. She did not say any of that. She told me where the flour was kept and how the water needed to be fetched before the pump froze each morning, and what time the younger girls needed to be in bed, and how Pearl's bottle was prepared, the exact temperature, and the way you had to hold it at an angle, or she would swallow air and wake up in pain. She went through each thing with the flat patience of someone who has given information to too many people who did not listen, and has stopped expecting that this time will be different. I listened without interrupting. I wrote nothing down but remembered everything, because I had kept a boarding house for 8 years, and that is the kind of work that teaches you to hold the specifics of how a place runs inside your head without effort. When Ruth finished, I said, "Thank you. I'll try not to undo what you've built before I understand it." She looked at me with her father's eyes. Then she held Pearl out to me, abruptly, the way you hand something to a person you're not sure can hold it. Pearl regarded me with the solemn concentration of a child old enough to have opinions and young enough to state them without speaking. She was smaller than I expected for 22 months. Thin in the way children get thin when they are fed adequately but not quite heartily enough. She did not cry when Ruth handed her over. She had been passed from arm to arm long enough that she received it without protest and waited to see what came next. She smelled like the particular sweetness of small children who had been sleeping in someone's arms. I held her and looked around the kitchen, which was clean and entirely without warmth, and I thought about the 22 words and what they had not said. Supper that first night was cornbread and salt pork that Clara had started before I arrived. Plain, adequate, eaten in a silence that had the quality of a habit, something that had set into the shape of grief and been mistaken for routine. Thomas ate, without looking at anything in particular. The middle girls ate steadily. Ruth ate while keeping one eye on Bess. Lily ate about half of what was on her plate and moved the rest into a pattern. The work of a child who needs to look occupied when the alternative is too much to sit with. After supper, while Ruth put the younger ones to bed, I washed the dishes. Thomas was still at the table with his coffee when I turned from the window. He was looking at Pearl's empty chair, the small one Ruth had wedged between hers and the wall so Pearl could not fall out of it. He was not looking at it the way you look at furniture. "Mr. Aldridge," I said. He looked up. "Does Pearl sleep through the night?" "Mostly. I'll take her when she wakes. Ruth needs a sleep." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You don't have to do that tonight. You just arrived." "I don't mind waking up," I said. "I haven't slept well in 2 years. It might be good to have a reason to get up." He looked at me in the way a person looks when they are trying to decide what kind of person says a thing like that. He nodded once and went out the barn without further conversation. I stood in the kitchen for a few minutes after he had gone. The house was settling around me, the sound of the younger girls being put down, a door latching on the floor above, the wind coming against the window. I thought about the boarding house in Cincinnati and the particular silence of rooms that had been empty to the person who made them feel like they meant something. I thought about 22 words in a newspaper. Then I went to check on Pearl. I had been at the Aldridge farm 4 days when Silas Croft came by. I was pulling spent squash plants in the kitchen garden when I heard his wagon. Croft was a wide man in his late 50s with the particular confidence of someone who has been the largest presence in a small landscape for long enough that he has stopped thinking about whether he ought to be. He ran a farm of 300 acres on the south side of the Aldridge property. He had the expensive wagon and the good coat of a man who was doing very well in a county where his neighbors were mostly not. He called to Thomas from the yard with the easy familiarity of someone who did not think about whether to knock. Thomas came out from the barn. I stayed in the garden, close enough to hear. Brought that paper I mentioned. Croft held out a folded document. Had my man in Platte Falls draw it proper. Fair price, Aldridge. $5,200 for the whole parcel. You'd have enough to relocate the girls somewhere easier. City, maybe, or a town where there's real schooling for Ruth and the others. Thomas took the paper, but did not unfold it. "I told you I'd think about it." "You've been thinking about it since March." Croft glanced at me in the garden, brief and dismissive. The way you glance at something that is not part of the conversation. "New woman's not going to change your yields, Aldridge." He was not wrong about the yields. He was very wrong about what he thought he knew. "I'll think about it," Thomas said again. Croft smiled with the patience of a man who expects a particular outcome and is simply waiting for the other person to arrive at it. He drove out the way he came. Thomas stood in the yard with the folded paper in his hands. Then he put it in his pocket and went back to barn. In those first weeks, I learned the shape of Thomas Aldridge's grief by watching what he did not do. He did not talk about Evelyn. Not once, not directly. Her name appeared sometimes in the girls' conversations. Mama's way of doing this. Mama always said that, and when it did, he went quiet in a particular way, not stiffening or pulling away, but simply going somewhere else briefly, the way a man does when a word lands on a bruise he has learned to work around. He did not look at her photograph, which sat on the mantel in the sitting room among the other small things that had belonged to her. A small vase, a piece of needlework she had apparently never finished, the framed photograph of the two of them from years before. He never looked at the mantel, which meant he was always aware of it. He ate. He worked. He spoke to the girls when they needed something. He answered questions when they were put to him. He did everything a man was supposed to do, and nothing that was not strictly required. I understood that kind of living. I had done it myself for several months after Robert died, going through the days in the shape of a person, while everything that made the shape worth having had simply stopped. The difference was that Robert and I had not had children, and when the boarding house debts came due, I had to wake up all the way simply in order to survive. Thomas had 6 daughters who needed him and a farm that demanded his attention, and those things had kept him functional. But functional and alive are not the same thing, and the difference was visible in the Aldridge farmhouse in every small way, in the mending pile that stayed on the porch until someone dealt with it, in the meals that were adequate but never good, in the silence at the supper table that had been allowed to become permanent. The third week brought something I had not anticipated. I was at the kitchen garden at dusk, checking what remained harvestable before the first hard frost, when I found Thomas standing at the far edge of it, looking at a section in the southwest corner that was entirely overgrown, weeds thick and tall, the ground underneath not disturbed in months. He was not working. He was simply standing there. I came to stand beside him. Underneath the weeds, faintly, there was a geometry of rows that had once been planted with intention. "Evelyn's," he said, before I could ask. She put in sweet peas and larkspur there. The herbs were on that side. He was quiet for a moment. I let it go. He walked back to the barn. I stood there a little longer. The weeds were not so deep they could not be cleared. The ground would still hold whatever you put in it. A week later, Clara came to me quietly and said that she had seen her father in the southwest corner of the garden before anyone else was up. I asked what he was doing. "Pulling weeds," she said. She looked at me the way you look at someone when you want to know if something matters, and I said that was a good sign. And she nodded and went back to what she was doing with the particular restraint of a 13-year-old who has learned that some things are better not pushed. I went back to the garden, and I noticed what I had noticed. The south fence line ran along the edge of a low meadow stretching down toward the creek. Croft's cattle were in it. They had been in it when I arrived, and I had assumed it was his land. But the fence was wrong. The post line cut off a significant piece of ground on the Aldridge side, a creek meadow, and a stretch of bottomland that would have been among the best ground on the whole property. Someone had moved the fence, or more accurately, allowed it to migrate year by year, post by post, until the boundary had shifted a good 15 yards north of where it had any right to be. Maybe Thomas had never noticed. He had spent 22 months surviving, not surveying. Maybe he had noticed and did not have the energy left for one more thing. Either way, Croft had cattle on land that did not belong to him, and he was offering $5,200 for a farm that, with that meadow restored, was worth considerably more. I am my father's daughter in certain ways. One of them is this. I grew up on 40 acres in Indiana before my father sold it when I was 16 and moved us all to Cincinnati, where things went somewhat better for a few years and then considerably worse for a long time. I watched my father sell that farm for less than it was worth to a man who knew more about what he was buying than my father did about what he was selling. I have thought about that for 22 years. I know what a property line looks like when someone has been working at it quietly. And I know what creek bottomland is worth to a wheat farmer in eastern Nebraska. I said nothing that day. There were things I needed to find first. Ruth's resistance was precise and consistent and never personal, which made it harder in some ways than if she had simply been cold. She did not undermine me. She did not put the girls against me or speak badly of me within my hearing. She simply watched everything I did with the careful attention of a girl who has learned that new things in this house tend to leave, and who has decided it is simpler not to invest until they prove otherwise. She had watched Thomas go hollow. She had watched the farm fall behind. She had watched 3 women from town come to help after her mother died and leave again within weeks because the work was too much and the distance too far. She had stopped expecting people to stay, and that was a reasonable thing to have done given the evidence. The first week, she watched how I handled Pearl, how I held the bottle, how I spoke to the baby when she fussed, whether I put her down the moment the noise stopped or whether I kept holding her anyway. The second week, she watched how I dealt with Lily. Lily had started coming downstairs before breakfast, in the dark, before the stove was lit, and standing in the kitchen, not asking for anything, just standing in the place where her mother had stood and where I now stood, looking at it, I understood what she was doing because I had done something similar for weeks after Robert died. Stand in the rooms where he had been, not try to bring him back, but try to find the shape of where he had been in the space around me. I began leaving a small task on the counter for her each morning, something that needed doing and that she could finish before the others came downstairs. Folding the dishcloths, filling the flour tin from the sack in the larder, checking the water in the stove reservoir. She did each thing with the focused gravity of a child who needs to feel useful because the alternative is too large to sit with. By the third week, Ruth had stopped folding the dishcloths herself and had begun leaving them for Lily to find. That was the first thing Ruth did that told me she was watching closely enough to understand what I was doing. Clara was the harder one in a different way. She had taken on the habit of starting supper before I came into the kitchen, then stepping back from the stove the moment I arrived, as if she was offering the task and removing herself from it in the same motion. It took me several days to understand that she was not being deferential. She was testing whether I would take over completely or whether I would make room for her. I made it a habit to come in and say, "What are you starting? Tell me what you need." The third time I said it, she stopped stepping back. By the end of October, she had her own opinions about seasoning that were sometimes different from mine and occasionally sharper, and I told her so, and the look on her face when I did was the look of a girl who'd been waiting a long time for someone to notice she had opinions worth having. Addie, 11, was the reader. There was not much to read in the Aldridge farmhouse. A Bible, an almanac, a seed catalog, 3 novels of uncertain origin with their covers torn off. Addie had read them all. I had packed 3 books in my trunk, which was more books than I packed of almost anything else, because when everything else in the boarding house went to settle Robert's debts, I could not bring myself to sell them. When I put them on the shelf in the sitting room, Addie appeared in the doorway within an hour, standing at the shelf, not quite reaching for them. "You may read them," I said. She took the middle one, and was not seen until supper. Thomas watched all of it from a distance. He ate the meals I put on the table, which were better than what the girls had been eating. Not because I had more ingredients, but because of the small attentions that distinguish food that is made from food that is merely assembled. He said little at the table, but he ate everything. And after the third week, he stopped standing up immediately after the last bite and began sitting for a few minutes after supper, the way people sit when they are, however, slightly reluctant to leave. The shift I could point to came on a Sunday in the 4th week. I made chicken and dumplings, using one of the older hens that Bess had regretfully identified as past the productive years. The kitchen smelled the way a kitchen should smell. Thomas came to the table and sat and looked at the bowl in front of him for a moment before picking up his spoon, the way a man looks at something that has caught him off guard. He ate 2 bowls. Ruth watched him eat the second one. After supper, when Thomas had gone out to the barn, she said to me, very quietly, "He hasn't had a second helping of anything since Mama died." She said it like a fact, but she was watching my face when she said it, and I understood that something in her had shifted, the way ice shifts on a river in early spring, barely visible at the surface. I nodded and washed the pot, and did not make more of it than it was. It was the 4th week when I found the tin. I had started working to the barn in the mornings, taking stock of what was there and what had been left adrift. Thomas kept his equipment with care, but had let the organization go. Harnesses hung without order. Grain bags were stacked unevenly with some of them open. Tools occupied corners they had been dropped into and never retrieved from. In the far corner, behind a grain bin, behind a canvas thrown over something and left, there was a wooden crate. The kind of crate someone had filled deliberately, one item at a time, and set aside, not discarding things, and not keeping them where they would be seen every day. Inside, a woman's work gloves, worn through at the forefinger, a jar of dried lavender sealed with wax, a seed envelope written in careful print, Evelyn's Sweet Peas, 1885, a small frame photograph of 2 young people in Sunday dress, the woman dark-haired and smiling slightly at the camera with the barely contained expression of someone trying to hold still. And underneath the photograph, a tin box about the size of a bread pan. Locked. I did not open it. I set it on the workbench and went to find Thomas. He was at the north fence with a post hole digger. I told him I had found the crate and the tin, and I asked whether the key was somewhere or whether I should leave it alone. He went still whenever I said something that reached somewhere. He kept guarded. Keys on a nail behind the kitchen door, he said, after a moment. Been there so long I stopped seeing it. I found the key on the nail among the others, small and iron, hanging where it had been invisible for 22 months in the way things become invisible when you cannot bring yourself to use them. I brought it back to the barn and opened the tin on the workbench with Thomas, standing at the barn door, not quite coming in, watching from the threshold the way a man stands when something is about to happen that he is not sure he is ready for. Inside the tin were documents, property documents. The original homestead certificate Thomas's father had filed with the county in 1871, a deed for 40 acres, recorded and stamped, with a legal description I read twice before I understood it completely, and folded separately inside the deed, a survey plat drawn in 1873 by a county surveyor named H. Olson, with every boundary marked in ink and measured a foot. I spread the plat on the workbench. The survey was precise and unambiguous. The property ran from the road south to the creek, from the eastern boundary to the western. The creek meadow was included in the description clearly, without qualification, all 16 acres of it, down to the water line, down to the stand of cottonwood trees on the far bank that I could see from where I stood in the barn doorway. I set the plat down and looked at Thomas at the threshold. When did Croft put that fence in? I said. Thomas frowned. Fence was always there. Has it always been in the same place? He was quiet. He came forward and looked at the survey plat for a long time. He oriented himself in it, finding the landmarks, the road, the creek, the cottonwoods. That fence is 15 yards north of where it should be, I said. Maybe more. The creek meadow is Aldridge land. It has been since your father filed this deed. Thomas said nothing. Croft's been grazing cattle on it for years, I said. He's been offering to buy this farm at a price that assumes he already owns the best ground on it. Thomas looked up at me from the plat. Then he looked out the barn door toward the south, where the fence ran the way it had always run, enclosing the meadow the way it had always enclosed it, because nobody had looked at a piece of paper drawn in 1873 and asked whether what was fenced and what was owned were the same thing. Croft told my father once, he said slowly, that creek ground was swampy and not worth farming. Said we were lucky we didn't have to maintain it. Creek bottomland at $30 an acre is not swamp, I said. It's the most fertile ground on this property. Your father knew it. He paid to have it surveyed and included in the deed. If you had farmed that meadow, your yields would not look the way they looked this past spring. Thomas was looking at his father's deed, at the signature at the bottom, at the county stamp beside it, at 20 years of careful record-keeping from a man who believed the world would honor what it had recorded. Croft's offer was $5,200, I said, for a farm that, with that meadow returned to the deed, is worth considerably more. How do you know what creek bottomland is selling for? He said. I grew up on 40 acres in Indiana before my father sold it when I was 16. I watched him sell it for less than it was worth to a man who knew more than he did about what he was buying. I have thought about that a great deal in the years since. Thomas looked at me for a longer moment than he usually allowed himself. Croft is coming Thursday, he said. He said he'd want an answer by end of week. I know, I said. I would like to be there when he comes. He read something in my face. What are you going to do? Show him what I just showed you, I said, and let him explain it. But first I went to the county land office in Platte Falls. I took the plat and the deed in the tin on a Tuesday, while Ruth kept the girls at the farm. The county recorder was a thin man named Dinsmore who wore reading spectacles on his nose and moved with the careful efficiency of someone who had spent 30 years making order out of other people's disorder. He pulled the original survey record without difficulty and compared it to the deed. He pulled every subsequent record filed on the Aldridge parcel. There was no formal boundary amendment, no easement, no recorded agreement of any kind that transferred any portion of the creek meadow to Croft or to any predecessor. Dinsmore looked over his spectacles. The property is recorded as Aldridge land in full accordance with the 1871 deed and the 1873 survey. If the fence line has migrated, that would be a matter for the county surveyor to document and the county court to adjudicate. He told me the process: a surveyor's visit, an affidavit, a filing, given the clarity of the original plat and the unambiguous deed record. There would not be much for a judge to do except confirm what the documents already stated. On the way home, I stopped at the grain elevator and spoke to a man named Ewald, who had known Thomas since he was a boy. I asked in a general way what creek bottomland was selling for in that county. He told me good bottomland with creek access was selling at $30 to $35 an acre. 16 acres of it would add $500 or more to the value of the Aldridge farm, and possibly considerably more if the soil was as good as the survey suggested. Croft's offer of $5,200 for the whole farm looked very different by the time I drove back toward Platte Falls. He was offering Thomas 40 acres at a price that assumed he already owned the best 16. He was buying a farm while quietly holding the most valuable part of it on his own side of a fence he had moved. He had waited for Thomas to be alone and behind on his accounts, and too consumed by grief to survey his own property line. He had waited 2 years, and he had very nearly gotten what he was waiting for. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Croft arrived on Thursday at noon. He came in his better wagon, dressed more carefully than before, with the air of a man who expects to close a transaction he has been managing toward for 2 years. Ruth had taken the younger girls to the Henderson farm at my request. Pearl was with Ruth. Thomas and I were at the kitchen table when Croft knocked and came in without waiting. He looked at the documents laid out on the table, at me sitting beside Thomas. Something moved across his face, quick and controlled. "Tom," he said, "I've brought a fair copy of the contract. My man in Platte Falls has it all drawn up." "Sit down, Croft," Thomas said. Croft sat. He placed his contract on the table with the deliberateness of someone placing a winning card. He looked at the plat and the deed without reaching for them. Thomas pushed the survey plat across the table. Mrs. Ware went to the county land office. Thomas said, "She found the original survey from 1873. Do you want to tell me when the south fence moved?" Croft looked at the plat. His face did not change. He was practiced. "Fence has always been where it is," he said. "Your father and mine agreed to it years ago." "Then you can produce the written agreement," I said. "The county recorder has no record of it." Croft looked at me with an expression that was not quite contempt. Something held in check by the calculation still going on behind his eyes. "Ladies don't usually handle property matters," he said. "This one does," Thomas said, and his voice had something in it I had not heard before. A density. The voice of a man who has been still for a long time and is no longer still. Croft picked up the plat. He studied it. He was deciding how far he could push the version of events in which the fence had always been there, and his neighbor had simply failed to notice for 20 years. "Tom," he said, setting the plat down, "you've been struggling here. Nobody in this county doesn't understand what Evelyn's death cost you. The farm's behind. You've got 6 girls and no good way to raise them alone on what this property's been earning. My offer is a clean start for all of them." "Your offer," I said, "is for 40 acres when the deed shows 56. It excludes 16 acres of creek bottomland that your cattle have been grazing on, for which you had no legal claim, no recorded easement, and no written agreement of any kind." Croft looked at Thomas. "You going to let your mail-order woman speak for you?" "I'm going to let her finish." Thomas said, "The boundary will be surveyed and filed with the county." I continued, "At that point you have 2 options. You can acknowledge the original deed and remove your cattle from Aldridge land, or you can contest it in county court and produce a document that does not exist." I folded my hands on the table. "I spoke with Mr. Dinsmore at the land office on Tuesday. The original deed record is unambiguous. If this goes before a judge, I don't think you'll be satisfied with the result." The kitchen was quiet except for Josephine moving around in the yard outside. Croft looked at Thomas for a long moment. Thomas looked back at him. 2 men who had known each other their whole lives, and something settling now between them into the shape it was always going to take. Croft stood. "I'll have my cattle off that meadow by Monday," he said. He picked up his contract and left without another word. Thomas sat at the table after the sound of Croft's wagon had faded down the road. He looked at the documents in front of him. The plat his father had paid to have drawn in 1873. The deed his father had filed with steady hands and particular faith of a man who believed the world would honor what it had recorded. He sat with it for a long time. When he spoke, it was not about the meadow. "Pearl's birthday is in 3 weeks," he said very quietly. "She'll be 2 years old." He stopped. I waited. Evelyn died the day Pearl was born, right around midday. The midwife didn't arrive in time. He put his hands flat on the table. "I have spent 22 months not being able to look at my own daughter without seeing the day she came into the world. And that is not a thing a man is supposed to say." I did not say anything. Some things are smaller, with words around them. "Ruth figured it out," he said. "She's been protecting Pearl from me, making sure Pearl had what she needed, because she knew I couldn't give it. 17 years old, and she has been doing that." He looked at the survey plat, at his father's handwriting on the deed, faded and precise. "My father worked that creek meadow," he said. "He told me when I was a boy that the bottomland was where the real work was, that if we ever drained it properly and put grain in it, we'd double our yield. I never got around to it. Then Evelyn died, and I stopped thinking about the future of this farm altogether. I was just trying to keep going." He looked at me. His face had the specific exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something a long time and has just put it down, not because the weight is gone, but because he has finally noticed that his arms are shaking. We sat in the kitchen for a while, with just the sound of the clock upstairs and the wind coming in off the open country to the north. I did not try to fill the silence. Some silences are not empty. After a time, he said, "I owe you an explanation about why the farm got into this state, not just the meadow." "You don't owe me anything." I said, "I want to tell it," he said. And he told me, not in the way people tell stories with a beginning and an end, but in the way a man tells something he has never said out loud to anyone, which is in pieces, out of order, stopping and starting. He told me about Evelyn, who had come from a family in Iowa, and had known how to make a farm feel like something worth living in. He told me about the last winter before she died, which had been hard, and how they had been behind on the land payments and the mill account and had talked about whether to sell. He told me about the morning she went into labor and the midwife who lived 6 miles east and the 4 hours it took to get to her and back and what he'd found when he returned. He told me about walking into the kitchen afterward with Pearl in his arms and not knowing what to do with either the child or himself. "I put her in Ruth's arms," he said. "Ruth was 15 years old. And I went out to the barn because there was nowhere else to go where nobody could see me." He stopped. "And then the days kept coming," he said. "And I kept getting up. And that was all I knew how to do." He looked at me. His face had the specific exhaustion of a man who has been carrying something a long time and has just put it down, not because the weight is gone, but because he has finally noticed that his arms are shaking. "What you did these past weeks," he said. "I didn't ask you to do that." "No," I said. "Why did you?" I thought about the 22 words and the 11 words in his first letter, and all the things they had not contained. "Because this farm has a future," I said, "and you stopped being able to see it." That didn't seem right to me. He was quiet. Outside, the light was moving west. Upstairs, the clock ticked the way it had ticked for years, indifferent to the seasons below it. "I haven't held Pearl," he said. "Not once since she was an hour old. I've kept her fed and alive, and Ruth has loved her, but I haven't held her." He stopped. "I'm afraid that if I do, I won't be able to stop," he said. "Crying, I mean. And if I start, I don't know when I'll finish." I looked at him for a moment. "That seems to me like a good reason to do it sooner rather than later," I said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but it was close to one, and from a man who had not had much occasion for that expression in 2 years, it was enough. He held Pearl that evening, after supper, after the younger ones were in bed. He sat in the rocking chair in the sitting room with Pearl on his lap, and she looked at him with the frank curiosity of a child who does not know yet that she should feel complicated about this man. And he looked at her, and I stayed in the kitchen and gave them whatever time that was. I heard nothing that I could specifically describe. When I came in to bank the stove, his face was different, still tired, still carrying what it had always carried. But something in it had come loose, the way something comes loose when it finally gives way and you realize it was a tension that had been holding you rigid, not the weight itself. Ruth was standing at the kitchen door, looking into the sitting room. She stood there a long time without washing anything. After a while, she said, still looking at her father with Pearl in his arms, "She's been waiting for him." I don't think she knew she was, but she has. I did not say anything. I banked the stove and gave them all the room they needed. The surveyor came from Platte Falls in the first week of October. He walked the south boundary and marked the original line, which was, as I had estimated, 15 to 17 yards north of where Croft's fence stood. Croft's cattle were already gone. He had moved them before Monday, as promised. Without comment, the formal boundary affidavit was filed at the county on October 14th. Thomas's name is on it. The property description now includes all 56 acres. Croft sent no response and made no attempt to contest it. A man with no documents to produce does not often choose a courtroom. Thomas began the drainage work on the creek meadow that same fall. 3 weeks of hard labor with a hired man from town, cutting channels to redirect the standing water, breaking the soil along the low banks where sediment had been building since the land was first broken. It was slow and heavy going. The girls and I brought food out at noon, and again at dusk. Pearl sat in the grass at the meadow's edge and watched the work with complete and solemn attention she brought to everything she found worth watching. In the spring, Thomas put winter wheat into the creek ground for first time. A household changes the way a field changes from March to May. You cannot point to the morning it was different. You only see it when you compare one end of the time to the other and notice how much distance has been covered. By November, Lily was eating full portions at supper and had stopped standing in the dark kitchen before breakfast, looking for someone who was not going to be there. She still missed her mother, and she would miss her all her life, but she had found a way to carry it that did not leave her stranded in empty rooms. By December, Addie had read all 3 of my books twice, and I had written to a lending library in Omaha that sent a parcel every 6 weeks. I made sure there was always something in the parcel for each girl, because a house with books in it is a different kind of house from one without. Clara, at 13, was becoming her own cook. Not mine, hers. She had opinions about seasoning that were different from mine, and sometimes better. I told her so. She tried to look like it didn't matter to her, and did not quite succeed. Bess was 6 and had appointed herself my primary informant on all matters relating to the chickens, the vegetable garden, the moods of the 2 barn cats, and a great many other subjects I had not known I needed information about. She followed me around the yard with the dedication of a small and highly vocal assistant. Ruth was the last to let anything show, which was right, because she had been carrying the most. One evening in late November, she sat down at the kitchen table after the others had gone upstairs and said, not looking at me, "I didn't think you'd stay." "I know," I said. "I thought you'd look at all of it and leave." "I looked at all of it," I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why did you stay?" "I thought about the farm, about the creek meadow, and the Platte and Pearl in Thomas's arms in the rocking chair, about 22 words in a Cincinnati newspaper, and all the things they had not said about what this place was or what it could be, because it was worth staying for," I said. She looked at the table for a moment. Then she nodded once, with her father's way of nodding, when a thing is decided, sure, absolute, the kind that does not invite further conversation because the matter is settled. Thomas and I were married in January at the county courthouse in Platte Falls, with Ruth and Clara as witnesses and the other 4 girls on the bench behind them. Bess wore her good dress and informed the judge about Josephine the hen at some length. The judge appeared to receive this information stoically. Thomas said his vows in the same tight, efficient voice he used for most things, looking at me the whole time. He was not a man who did things halfway. When he decided to do something, he did it with his whole attention, and marriage, it turned out, was no different. In the wagon on the way home, with the girls in the back talking over each other in the cold air, he said, "I don't know what I thought would happen when I put that ad in the paper." "What did you think?" I said, "I thought someone would come and cook the meals, and the girls would have someone to talk to, someone steady." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't think the whole thing would turn around." "It didn't turn around," I said. "It was always here. It just needed someone to look at it who wasn't standing too close." He was quiet again. The winter fields went past on either side, the creek meadow visible in the distance through the bare cottonwoods, flat and dormant, and full of what the spring was going to do with it. "I've been thinking about the lower meadow," he said. "I know," I said. "I heard you and Ruth talking about it." He glanced at me. The corner of his mouth moved. "I also think you should write to the grain contact in Omaha," I said. "The one in your ledger from 1882. Ewald at the elevator told me the rates there are better than what you've been getting." Thomas looked at me for a longer moment. "How long have you known about the ledger?" "Since the week I arrived," I said. He faced forward again. The corner of his mouth moved again, more than before. It was not quite a smile, but it was in that direction, and from a man who had not had much occasion for that expression in 2 years. It was enough to make something loosen in my own chest that I had not known was still tight. The spring planting of the creek meadow is its own story. When Thomas broke that ground in April, the soil was exactly what his father had described: dark, loose, rich with a particular abundance of bottomland that has been running with snowmelt and creek silt for decades, patient, waiting for someone with the sense to plant it. Ruth stood at the meadow's edge when the first rows went in and watched her father work the ground. She stood there a long time, and I stood beside her, and neither of us needed to say anything about it. Some things are visible enough without language. By August, the wheat in the creek meadow was standing a foot taller than the wheat in the upper field. Thomas walked the rows in the evenings and ran his hand along the stalks the way a man touches something he had almost stopped believing in. The yield that fall was nearly twice what it had been the year before. Not entirely because of the meadow, but the meadow was where the difference started. Croft sent a letter in September offering to purchase the meadow acreage specifically at $40 an acre. Thomas did not reply. Addie turned 12 in October. Ruth turned 18 in November, and for her birthday I asked what she wanted, expecting something practical. She said she wanted to go to the school in Platte Falls on Tuesdays and Thursdays, the one that ran extended classes for older students. She had been thinking about it for a year, she said, but there had been no one to watch the younger girls on those days. "Go," I said. "Someone has to be here." "I'll be here," I said. "That's what I'm for." She stood there for a moment. This girl who had held a household together through 2 years of grief on no salary and no thanks, and the simple necessity of being the oldest one present, who had braided her sister's hair and walked Pearl back and forth at night, and managed a father who had gone somewhere she could not follow, and who had done all of it without being asked because someone had to, and she was the one who was there. "Mrs. Aldridge," she said, and the word she used was not my maiden name, which was what she had always used before. I looked at her. "Thank you," she said. I nodded. Thomas's way. Pearl turned 2 in late October, 3 weeks after Croft's cattle had come off the meadow for good. Thomas made her a small wooden horse, working on it in the barn in the evenings over the course of a week. He put beside her bowl at breakfast on the morning of her birthday, and Pearl regarded it with the seriousness she brought to most things, and then she picked it up with both hands and announced, with complete certainty, "Mine!" Thomas's face in that moment is not something I will try to put into words. I will say only that he lifted her out of her chair and carried her around the kitchen on his shoulders while she held the wooden horse in the air above his head, and the other girls watched from around the table. And the kitchen smelled like the cornbread in the oven and the coffee on the stove, and outside the October light was coming to the window the way it does in Nebraska in the fall, flat and gold and particular to that place, and that hour and no other. Ruth stood at the kitchen door with her arms at her sides. Not folded, at her sides. The following spring, the wheat from the Omaha contact brought a good price. Thomas told me the number in the evening, directly, the way a man tells things to someone he's gotten used to telling things to. He also said that he had used part of the fall's profit to pay off the mill account in full, and had set aside a small amount towards schooling for Addie, who had written to a school in Lincoln asking about enrollment, and received a response that had sent her to the barn to read it in private, which was where she went when she did not want to be seen feeling something too strongly. We stood on the porch that evening and looked at the farm. The creek meadow was green all the way to the cottonwoods. The upper field was planted. Ruth was at her Tuesday school. Clara had taken over the kitchen 3 nights a week and was working from a pie crust recipe she had found written on a card in her mother's handwriting in the back of the recipe box, and she made it in her own way, which was slightly different and not worse. Lily had started teaching Bess to read and had discovered she was patient at it, and that teaching was something she was built for. Pearl was in the yard with her wooden horse, examining the world with complete attention. Addie was somewhere in the house with a book. What do you think about it all? Thomas said, I thought about 22 words in a Cincinnati newspaper, the train station at Platte Falls, the tin box in the corner of the barn, and the survey plat drawn in 1873, and a man standing at a barn door not quite coming in. Lily's face when she found a task waiting for her in the mornings. Ruth's arms, that one evening, finally at her sides. Pearl on Thomas's shoulders with the wooden horse held above his head, announcing to the kitchen that it was hers. I think your father knew what this land was worth, I said, and I think he was right about all of it. Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said he used to say that good land does most of the work if you give it half a chance, that the farmer's job is mostly to not get in the way of what the land already wants to do. He sounded like he was a sensible man. I said, he was. Thomas said, I forgot that for a while. He put his hand over mine on the porch railing and left it there, and we stood in the evening light together and watched the farm go about being what it had always been capable of being, given half a chance, under a particular sky that stretched in Nebraska in the year that things came right again. The creek meadow was green all the way to the cottonwoods. The wheat stood straight in the rows his father had first broken 50 years before. Pearl was in the yard, and the girls were where they were supposed to be, and the house behind us was full of the sounds of people who were going to be all right. It was enough. More than enough. It was the whole thing, exactly as it was. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.